I'm back! So, gender roles. In today's day and age, they're still somewhat intact, but they've kind of been broken down, but that's all rather new. Gender roles have been present in human societies since forever. Even if you look back in prehistory, you'll see gender roles assigned, but those were assigned more for survival than for societal expectations. In fact, these roles were so vital, they have influenced the way men and women have evolved to today. So let's go back to about 2 million years ago when we see the first example of a human species, Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus and other human species had to live in groups and have a home base because humans are not exactly the best fit for survival on their own. I mean, we're squishy and not very strong, but we've got big brains. Anyway, these groups had to work together really hard to survive, and eventually these groups developed into hunter-gatherer forms. And mind you, this is hunter-gatherer societies 2 million years ago with Homo erectus, and there have been many other human species since then, until you get to today. So, these gender roles of the hunter-gatherer societies have been ingrained in our biology, really, since the beginning of humankind. So, humans and human species living in these hunter-gatherer groups had to learn to divide the labor because it's a lot of work to try to survive off the land alone. And the division of labor was determined by one very, very important thing. The females could have babies! The women had to be kept home so that they could raise the children and make sure they didn't all die. Pretty important. So what were the roles? Well, it's kind of obvious in the name, hunter, gatherer. You've got two to choose from. So the men were the hunters. So the men had two jobs. They had to hunt for meat, and they had to protect the camps. When they would hunt, they would usually go in a group and pursue one big animal, and then they would kill it and bring it home to feed everybody. And when they were back at the camps after their hunt, they would have to be on constant lookout. They were the ones that protected everybody. They were always putting their lives at risk every time they went out to hunt because, like I said, humans wouldn't stand a chance in nature if it wasn't for the size of our brains. The women were gatherers. They had two jobs. They had to gather any other food that the group might need besides meat and raise the children. Now, when you gather food, you have to know what's edible, you have to know when it's in season, you have to know where to find it, and you have to know how much of it to get so that you can feed everyone and make sure nobody goes hungry. The food the women would gather would provide around 50 to 75% of the group's diet altogether because the men wouldn't always come back with meat. Sometimes the hunts failed. And in addition to gathering and trying desperately to figure out what they could and could not eat, they also had to raise the kids. Since both these roles were essential for survival, the traits and skills necessary to do both of them have become part of our instincts as humans. In fact, if we look at modern day men and women, we'll see how those two gender roles from the past influence the way we think today. For instance, men. Men are goal-oriented. They focus on one thing at a time, and they hone in on that task and do it. Kind of like how hunters would hunt one big animal and kill it and bring it home. They had one goal, and then they were done. Men are less driven by their emotions and more driven by their logic, or their sex drive, but usually their logic, and that means that they're a lot more rational, or at least they like to think so. And women, they're better at multitasking. They're able to retain a lot of knowledge and learn a lot of things at once. Their minds are constantly working. Women let their intuition and their emotions dictate a lot of their decisions and actions. Now, there were obviously some exceptions to these gender roles. I mean, there is evidence of female hunters. There were probably men that gathered. And as for the non-binary people, well, we'll touch on them in a second. Now let's fast forward to roughly 10,000 years ago, when humans started settling down into agrarian societies. That means we started farming. As soon as people settled down, we weren't living in groups anymore, but in families. And then the gender roles started to change again. Marriage became a concept around 2500 BC, and with it came a lot of expectations. Men were expected to provide for their family. They didn't have to hunt anymore, but they had to have a job or a profession, a way to make money to buy food to provide for their family. Men would become farmers or craftsmen or artisans or something of the like, and that was the way they were successful. Now, as we've established, women are the only ones that can have babies, so they had to stay home and watch the children, which being a they didn't have to gather anymore, but watching children is a full-time job, especially if you're doing it yourself. So, women were confined to the house and domestic duties. Now, unfortunately, marriage wasn't created to get two individuals together at first. It was originally created as a financial transaction to ensure that the bloodline stayed safe. So it was two families coming together and making an agreement. They'd have a groom and a bride. The groom's family would pay the bride's family for the bride, and she would become the groom's wife. And that made her his property. So women have been seen as property, second-class citizens, and inferior to men since the institution of marriage, pretty much. Now, as for the non-binary folk, they've been around for as long as we've been writing stuff down, so realistically, they've probably been around for longer. The first recorded evidence we see of the ancient they-thems was in about 1700 BCE in Mesopotamia. These people were called Gala. They didn't identify as either male or female, and usually were priests for the goddess Inanna. These stone tablets describe in great detail how non-binary people were made by the gods and what their roles in society were. Non-binary people being given special roles or divine roles in society has been a constant across a lot of human cultures. Basically, the conclusion I've come to with this is the non-binaries are ethereal and they should be feared. So let's now fast forward to the turn of the century between the 19th and 20th century. This is around the time when women started to advocate for their rights. They wanted suffrage, they wanted education, they wanted the right to work. They wanted to be treated like equals rather than secondary citizens. They wanted to prove that their worth was determined by more than just their ability to have children. And since then, we haven't stopped working toward gender equality. It's still not the reality in a lot of places, but it has gotten significantly better. And now women can work and get educated and stuff. It's great. So if we fast forward to now, the gender roles have basically gone out the window. Sure, some people still follow the traditional gender roles set up by heterosexual marriage. A lot of people are happy that way, and go them. But a lot of it has changed due to some pretty interesting factors in society. First off, gay marriage. When you marry an individual of the same sex, the division of labor in your household isn't determined by what gender you are, and more by who wants the career and who wants to stay home with the kids. Even in some heterosexual couples, the gender roles have switched because the woman wants a career and the man wants to be close to his family. And since non-binary people have been, allowed to exist, they've kind of torn up the gender binary and thrown it on a flaming bonfire. So basically, the conclusion I've come to is gender is a social construct and you should just do what makes you happy. So yeah. Congratulations! You made it to the end of the video. Thank you so much for listening to me explain something that didn't really need to be explained. You can check out the rest of my channel in the links below and also my social media. See you guys next time.